Hey, welcome back. This is part of me trying to do more videos, and this is a great time of year to do it. Sorry if there's loud noises, by the way, there's like construction around. But yeah, this is a great time of year for me to try to get back into videos because we're coming up on fall, which is my favorite time of year, specifically because of Halloween, kind of spooky season. So today, I'm going to do a few kind of spooky season vibes. And videos. So yeah, today is essentially a list of recommendations. These are some spooky season books that I recommend to you. Some of them are kind of science fiction, fantasy, horror, but all of them are a bit kind of, spooky. So yeah, without further ado, these aren't in any order. I've got 8 books that I would recommend if you're looking for maybe a bit of horror, maybe a bit of gothic, maybe a bit of spooky. Okay, first book is Something Wicked This Way Comes by Ray Bradbury. This is like the closest thing I can compare it to is like Neil Gaiman before Neil Gaiman. So this reminds me of Neil Gaiman's book The Ocean at the End of the Lane. It is about 2 young boys growing up. They're probably like 11 or 12 or 13, around that age, and a carnival comes to town, and it becomes very clear right away that there's something off about this carnival. There's something mysterious, there's something kind of malicious. Strange things start happening around the carnival, and it's these 2 boys kind of exploring that and getting caught up in the kind of mystery and horror of that. Really beautiful book. Ray Bradbury's prose is really incredible, but really beautiful book about growing up, about nostalgia, about childhood, and about the horrors that only children experience. There's a great quote by Neil Gaiman. I forget exactly what it says, but he talks about that with The Ocean at the End of the Lane, where there's a certain type of horror that is based on what children are able to see or imagine that adults can't. So it's a horror unique to children. So this really plays on that. It's a really cozy book. It's a pretty creepy book, and it's a really warm autumnal book. So definitely check this one out. The next one is a very recent read for me, and it's maybe one of my favorites of the year so far. And this is Nightborne, Cold Fire Rising by C.S. Friedman. This was a complete surprise to me because this is a prequel to the Cold Fire trilogy by C.S. Friedman, which is a kind of dark fantasy trilogy from the 90s, and I've read the first book, Black Sun Rising, and I thought it was okay. I don't really know that I would have continued on with the series, but then I saw this book, and this is brand new. It just came out this year, and it's a prequel, so I decided to read this, and I'm recommending it even separate from that series because I think this works very well on its own. And yeah, so that series as background is essentially about a distant planet that humans have colonized called Urna, and there's essentially a type of life form there called the Fae that to humans look very much like demons and spirits and things like that. It's a very like supernatural kind of looking thing to humans. So as humans have settled on this planet, it's kind of brought them back to a medieval-esque level of technology, and it's kind of created a kind of sorceress setting. So the original trilogy reads really like fantasy, but this is very much a science fiction book. This is like science fiction horror, which is a subgenre that I really love, and I'm looking for more of those types of books. So yeah, this follows the first mission to this planet, Urna, and it follows the team of scientists that land on the planet and start building the first settlement. And their first interactions with whatever this alien life force is, whether it's, an actual species, whether it's a chemical thing happening on the planet, they don't know. But yeah, it follows their interactions with this really mysterious sentience on this planet. Really cool book. The cool thing about the creatures of this series is that they can manifest your emotions and desires and fears. So it's really creepy stuff about, fears or these creatures kind of luring you or targeting you based on your really specific fears. So really great horror stuff in here, and very cool science fiction stuff. It's very much a science fiction look at what is usually considered a supernatural or fantastical thing. So very great book. I might even do a full review of this soon, because I just think it's such a standout sci-fi horror. Next is actually my current read, so I can only vouch for the first 100 pages or so, but I'm really enjoying it, and that's Summer of Night by Dan Simmons. This is an author that's had a bit of a tricky history with me. I read Hyperion, and I actually DNF'd it. I read the first half of it, and I had to put it down because it just really wasn't clicking for me. Decided to give him another try, and I read his first novel, Song of Kali, and I really didn't like it. I finished it, but I really didn't like it. So I decided to give him one more try, and I read a book that I will mention actually in a couple of minutes, and I loved it. So this is my next encounter with him, Summer of Night. This is one of his more famous horror novels, and yeah, I'm only 100 pages in, but I'm loving this. It takes place in summer actually, but it feels very autumnal. It follows a group of young boys that just finished, I think they finished 6th grade, so they're all maybe 11 or 12 years old. Takes place in 1960s in a kind of small town in Illinois. And yeah, it follows these 6 boys that are starting their summer vacation and kind of the wonders of, childhood and specifically kind of boyhood, summer freedom, Americana, nostalgia, all those things. And really creepy, scary things start happening in this town. And it seems to all be based around the school that they all went to. That is now shutting down after many, many years. Really cool book so far. Very much, like I said, it reminds me of It by Stephen King, because it's very much about that nostalgia, similar to Ray Bradbury and Neil Gaiman, the horror that children can kind of experience that sometimes adults can't. So very much a nostalgic book about growing up and the kind of fears that children experience and how that impacts their childhood and kind of ending their childhood in a lot of ways. Really creepy stuff. I'm really impressed with how right off the bat, like really early on, some creepy stuff starts happening in this. So yeah, really, really enjoying this. That's all I can think of. I had something else to say, but I can't remember. But yeah, that's Summer of Night by Dan Simmons. The next one is a great modern vampire story, and this is The Lights of Prague by Nicole Jarvis. This is a historical fantasy with horror elements, takes place in 19th century Prague, and yeah, it follows Domek Miska, who is I think they're called lamplighters, and so essentially their main job is to go around lighting the gas lamps of Prague. But their more secret job is that they are part of a kind of guild of vampire hunters. It sounds a bit silly, but it's a really well-researched historical novel and a really thrilling kind of horror fantasy. So yeah, very exciting. The vampires, they're called something else. I think they're called Pajavis in this. They're quite frightening, they're quite cool. Interesting twists on kind of vampire lore, and there's other kind of creatures in this as well. That are all very interesting and fun to read about. There's a great kind of tense romance in this book as well between Domek and Lady Ora Fisherova, who's a stellar character. Anytime she's on the page, it's such an interesting read. She's one of my favorite characters I've read in the last couple of years. And yeah, it essentially follows Domek and Lady Ora, and neither of them kind of knows the extent of each other's identity. And they both end up dealing with a kind of conspiracy of these Pajavis, these vampires. I won't spoil anything, but yeah, very, very fun book. Really well researched, really atmospheric, and just a great fall read. Now we return to Dan Simmons. This is The Terror. This is that third book I read of his that really actually convinced me that, he is actually a really good writer. Those first 2 books just weren't it for me. This is a historical horror novel that does have a supernatural element to it, right? Like there is a fantastical supernatural element, but that's not where most of the horror comes from, which is what really surprised me about this book. This is quite a thick, it's kind of deceivingly small here, deceptively small. It's really actually quite a thick book. It's like 700 pages or something. And yeah, it's a historical novel based on the HMS Terror and Erebus, which were two kind of famous British Navy ships or British exploratory ships exploring the Arctic that kind of failed and never returned. So this is a historical novel about that. And there is also a beast of some sorts on the ice kind of stalking these ships. That part is really scary and really interesting to read about, and it introduces itself right away. You know, for such a thick book, I was kind of expecting a really slow burn, and there's elements of that to it, but it's something like chapter 1. It establishes there's a beast hunting them as they're trudging their way through the ice. But yeah, so it follows these two expeditions on these ships as just everything goes wrong. Their rations, you know, are dwindling, and also some of them are spoiled. You know, the spring doesn't thaw the ice enough, so they become trapped in the ice for long, like months and months at a time. Kind of paranoia and mania start to settle in. So most of the horror comes from more mundane things, but it doesn't make it any less thrilling. You know, this book is really tense and just builds tension throughout the entire thing that, you know, when the supernatural stuff happens, it's just adding, you know, salt to the wound, but it's already such a vicious book before that. So yeah, fantastic novel, incredibly well researched, you can tell. From the language he uses to the way he talks about the level of technology they had at this time, the way he talks about the types of clothing they wore, really stellar stuff. And yeah, a bit of a long book, and at times a bit of a slow burn, but really worth the investment. I thought this is fantastic. This is a great fall read, and even more a winter read, you know, maybe late spooky season, because it is, you get a sense of just being terribly cold and isolated in this book. So fantastic thriller / horror. Then we have a novella, which is What Moves the Dead by T. Kingfisher. This was such a surprise to me. I picked it up just on chance. I picked it up, frankly, because of the cover. It's one of my favorite covers I've ever seen. And I knew little to nothing about it. And I found out it's essentially retelling of The Fall of the House of Usher by Edgar Allan Poe. And so that kind of gothic element really interested me. And yeah, this is, you know, I don't want to spoil the Poe story, but this definitely goes in its own direction. But yeah, it's essentially the House of Usher and one of their friends, a friend of the family, kind of coming to visit them after years away and seeing the strange kind of type of disrepair that the house and the family members have fallen into, and whether or not there's a kind of parasitic element to it. I really won't spoil much. It's the Fall of the House of Usher mixed with fungal horror. A lot of stuff about mushrooms in this book. Fantastic, fantastic read. I read it in about a day, and it's just propulsive. Okay, next one. These next two are classics. One's a modern classic, and one is more of a classic. And this is Salem's Lot by Stephen King. This is Stephen King's second published book after Carrie, and it is fantastic. This is the book that really convinced me that King is actually a really talented technical writer. I'd read a lot of Stephen King when I was a kid. You know, I read Carrie and The Shining and The Stand and It and all that stuff. And I liked it because it was scary, it was exciting. And then I kind of drifted away from it, and I never really read him as an adult. So I picked this up a year or two ago, and I loved it. He's actually a really smart writer. Like, in terms of crafting a narrative, this thing it's propulsive, it's fast-paced, it's quite intricate at times. It's fantastic. This essentially tells the story of Ben Mears, who is, I believe, a writer who grew up in this town of Jerusalem's Lot, also known as Salem's Lot, and he is returning after years. I forget why. I think it's because he's working on a novel, and he kind of wanted to come back to this place that's full of maybe dark memories for him. And essentially, you know, without spoiling too much, vampires are around, and a slow kind of takeover of the town is underway. And it follows Ben Mears and a few other characters um, learning of this and then having to confront it. Really great horror in this novel. Like, I mean, King is one of the kings of horror for a reason. Really great horror in this. But also, like, you know, with a lot of King that I always personally kind of forget about, a lot of really great emotion and character moments. There's some really heartbreaking, you know, scenes in this. And they work so well because he really invests a lot of time into his character work. So yeah, this was a literary surprise for me, and as a horror book, it's one of the classics for a reason. And last but not least, we have one of really the horror classics. I don't know how well this will show up on the screen. Not great, but this is my fancy edition of Dracula by Bram Stoker. So this is one of the giants of kind of horror literature. This came out in 1897, 100 years before I was born. And because of that, I was kind of intimidated by it, because it's more, you know, it's of a different era. And I was expecting it to be a bit dated and a bit slow, a bit tedious, in that way that, you know, a lot of literary classics are. And I was really pleasantly surprised that it's none of those things. This is a incredibly readable and interesting book. First thing to note about this book really is that it's epistolary, so structurally it's kind of unique and an interesting reading experience that I feel like we don't read too much of in popular literature. So epistolary meaning that, you know, the book is comprised of excerpts of people's diaries and newspaper clippings, right? So it's told in a way through kind of in-world letters and diaries and journals and newspapers and things like that. And yeah, I mean, the story is very famous at this point, right? Jonathan Harker going to Transylvania to help with the real estate dealings of a very mysterious count named Dracula, who is looking to purchase land in London. And then it follows just the journeys of Jonathan and his terrifying encounters with Dracula, as well as his fiancée Mina and her friends in London as this kind of horror is migrating to London. Really interesting book. Very, you know, the horror actually really held up. It's quite frightening. It's quite funny, actually, at times. I think Abraham Van Helsing is always portrayed as really stoic and cold and all that stuff in a lot of the movies. And he's effusively friendly and silly in this book, which I thought was so interesting. So yeah, very fun to read. Also kind of an interesting historical artifact of a book, because it very much, there's a great book, I haven't read it actually, but there's a book I'm very interested in called That Line of Darkness, which is about Gothic horror as a reflection of kind of Victorian era social values and kind of fears. And, you know, so there's a lot in this about Orientalism and kind of fear of the East and fear of frankly, you know, blood impurity, right? So there's really interesting historical glimpses you get through reading this book of how Britain, or maybe even Western Europe, the author was Irish, Bram Stoker was Irish, but how kind of the Western world, Western Europe at least, kind of looked at the Ottoman Empire, looked at the Orient as it was called. So yeah, really interesting kind of glimpse into that as well, and how that reflects in the horror literature of this time. But yeah, at the end of the day, also just a propulsively, engagingly fun read. So those are my 8 spooky season recommendations. Some classic stuff, some modern stuff, some really long stuff, short stuff, some historical literature, historical fiction, science fiction, tons of stuff. All of these are great, and I hope you read them. If you have, let me know, and let me know your recommendations to me if you've got other books that you love to read around this time of year. So thanks for checking in, and I will be back hopefully with more videos soon.